Now, before we start, I will note that this session is being recorded. With that said, I'm going to turn it over to the panel and ask them to do a brief introduction. And we're going to go ahead and start with Joseph Johnson first, please.
Thanks, Jorge. Hi, everyone. This is Joe Johnson. I'm a partner and managing director with LEK. I've been with the firm since 2000, and I work in our healthcare services practice and actually lead a lot of our healthcare IT and tech-enabled services work here in the Americas. So nice to meet you all.
All right, and then we'll transition to Ben.
Hi everyone, I'm Ben Steinbeck, and I'm a product manager with Telehealth, which is a technology spinoff of Blue Shield of California. I work in the virtual care space. I'm leading a team who builds virtual care technologies primarily for independent practices, dealing with things like burnout and billing, things like that.
Thank you, Ben. And we'll transition over to Oran.
Hi, everybody. Oran Stenish here. I am a VP of New Product Development in OptumRx's Product and Strategy organization. So we're a pharmacy benefit manager, as well as a number of owned pharmacies, home delivery, specialty, and otherwise. And I work, again, in product. I've been with Optum for 8 years. Prior to OptumRx, I was on our Optin Health side of the business, so condition and case management. And I love Ramba, happy to be here. I was one of the student organizers when I was in business school back in 2011. So thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here, Oran. And last but not least, we have Ian.
Hello, everyone. Ian Tseng. I'm a partner with LEK in Boston. I've been with the company just north of 22 years. Have been involved with reaching out in one way or another since 2003 and have been an annual attendee ever since. And very excited here. Whereas Joe does a lot on more healthcare IT, telemedicine related to provider and payer side of things, I come more from the therapeutic side. So I work with pharma companies and technology providers, clinical trial technologies, as well as patient engagement technologies that are used there. So looking forward to the conversation and welcome everyone.
I could do it.
Thank you, guys. I'm going to go ahead and make sure that everybody's on mute. So before we get into the Q&A session, I'm going to turn it back to Joseph Johnson, who's going to say a few words before we get started. Joseph?
Great, thanks, Jorge. Well, thanks to all of you for taking time out of your busy schedules and joining the panel. LEK is thrilled to be sponsoring this panel today. We are a global strategy consulting firm, and we work across all industries. Healthcare is an area in which we do a good amount of our work. It's certainly near and dear to my heart in the work that I do within healthcare services. Telemedicine is a very timely topic these days in light of COVID. I think COVID has really provided some of the impetus and almost serves as an inflection point, I think, for telemedicine and telehealth, and has eradicated some of the structural barriers that were needed to be tackled in order to drive adoption. So really looking forward to the discussion here. I think it's, like I said, it's a very timely topic in light of current events. And with that said, I'll hand the mic back to Jorge and team to start with the questions.
Thank you, Joe, for that introduction. So we're going to go ahead and get started with the Q&A portion. Now, keep in mind that we want this to be as organic as possible. So to all of the attendees who are here, feel free to drop your questions in the chat, or as preferred, if you could unmute and ask your question live. You do not have to wait until the end of the Q&A portion to ask your questions. You can ask your questions as we go on. With that said, we'll go to the first question, and this goes to all of the panel. Do you think that the growth that we have seen in telemedicine is sustainable and will continue to grow post-COVID, and why?
I can start off on this. You know, when seeing this question, I reached out to a lot of my clinical partners to talk to them about, you know, what their experiences have been during COVID, pre, and then, you know, what they expect after. The example I wanted to give was, you know, a 10-doc practice who prior to COVID was doing about 30 to 40 virtual visits a month. When COVID hit, they went to 845 at the high in March. They were not prepared for lost revenue. They weren't prepared for social distancing. And so it was drop everything, use any tool available, use Zoom, use FaceTime, and let's get to seeing our patients virtually. They've since dropped back to about 200 a month. And speaking with them and some of the other resources on my team, the expectation is maybe, depending on a specialty and depending on a use case, maybe 20 to 30% of visits could be to be virtual. There's still problems with telehealth. Providers are still having issues connecting. Patients are still having issues connecting. And so I hope with, you know, this normalization and fitting and making sure that the use case is correct and then the technology is better, that we'll see that sustained growth.
Yeah, this is Iran. I think that's right on, and I think that you know, COVID created a situation where regulations were eased substantially. I feel like telehealth is something that within the industry we were always talking about, kind of being at a tipping point, and then all of a sudden COVID struck and we just were there. And obviously the circumstances around COVID really pushed, like, you know, I think your number is 845 when previously they were seeing 40 virtual visits. You know, that's like a huge swing, and it's going to swing back, but not back to pre-COVID times. And so figuring out, you know, how people are using telehealth, I think reimbursement is going to be really important. So will telehealth visits be reimbursed at parity with in-person visits? To your point, Ben, just use cases and from a utilization perspective, are people using telehealth in addition to in-person visits, or are there specific use cases where telehealth has its own kind of differentiated value prop?
Yeah, I'd like to add, as we go into this, though, a couple of different things, and I agree with what's said. I mean, COVID is creating an environment where it's necessary, as opposed to, you know, an ideal or benefit of some just a pure new benefit of what's going there. But a couple points. The need for telemedicine or remote medicine, it didn't start with COVID in any way. I mean, this is something where access to medicine, healthcare facilities, of what's out there is when you get to more remote communities, has always been challenged, right? As you think about even hospitals in the area, the facilities and services that are there, and the ability to actually sustain those economic models. And plus people are getting busier, right? So the idea of remote medicine, telehealth is helpful for things that are less urgent. It allows more efficiency, but if used properly, but it allows more efficiency in the healthcare system, potentially it improves access for various sort of non-intensive, non-urgent services that you need. And that's not going away, and that's not changing. You know, certainly telemedicine and the concept of it adds its own access barriers, right? Broadband access, access to screens, access to other types of things like that, which are not, again, universal. And even though, yes, some people will pay their internet bill before their rent, that doesn't mean everybody has access necessarily. So that's going to continue, right? You know, I know busy parents who are like, oh, if I could do a doctor visit over telemedicine and I could get my kid a doctor's note without going into the office, like they'll use it and they'll pay a lot of money just for that, right? The fact that they don't need to take a day off of work in the morning and go into the office and things like that. The other thing I want to make a point, though, is I don't want to define telemedicine as strictly a Zoom-based consultation, right? I mean, this is actually something which involves, when you think about remote medicine, involves quite a lot of things. One is additional infrastructure, but it could involve remote monitoring, right? Diagnostic tests and devices that are there. There are technologies that are being developed for certain types of chronic patients where there are effectively electronic lockbox vending machines in your home, where when you need a medication, when it's time for you to do it, it'll dispense it. Look, there's some issues if you put a controlled substance in a lockbox in somebody's home, but there are things like that that people are trying to develop, right? It's also about kiosks. You know, there are companies like American Well who are developing kiosks that you can put in corporate offices or just in various locations, which are no bigger than, like, you know, a fancy London electronic toilet that you see on the street somewhere, where you can go in and get basic diagnostic things happening. It might also be involved in that on how you do drop shipments in terms of equipment, or how you, when needed, send a nurse or other healthcare practitioner on demand in different places, right? We're actually talking about how do you create distributed healthcare in a way that's more efficient for the system, creates better outcomes, and actually broadens access to a broader set of folks. And for me, the promise of telemedicine is not just a face-to-face consultation, but it's all of those things which really, one, increase access, but also reduce the cost curve of what it costs to serve those people and deliver healthcare to everybody here in the US or globally and otherwise. And so I think that's where the promise is. Lots of hurdles to get there, but that's really the potential.
Yeah, key to that is who's going to pay for it. You know, groups that carry risk and payers, I see them shifting to chronic care management using telehealth, along with asynchronous visits, e-monitoring, that kind of thing. So you have a kind of a risk-bearing group that can use it. Then you have the teledocs, the MD Lives, the American Wells out there who are providing virtual urgent care to anyone. We can all see a doctor within 10 minutes on any of those platforms. And then the third part of it, and there's more than three, is the actual provider themselves. How do we enable that provider to see their patients, sometimes under their own dollar, to see their patients? So a big question is, who's going to pay for it and who's going to get reimbursed for it?
Yeah, and just to pile on, I mean, a couple thoughts. One, just in terms of who's going to pay for it, I feel like some of these other telehealth or telemedicine platforms, be it things like Livongo, Omada, Real Appeal, et cetera, for diabetes, and so on and so forth. I mean, I think there are questions around engagement and affordability driven by some of those as well. So I think there is an element of proving out that's still an open question with some telemedicine capabilities. Kind of related to that, then to adding on to what you said, Ben, but in addition to the telemedicine providers, there's now integration, again, with Livongo and Teladoc, kind of integrating between care delivery and, health service applications with interesting opportunity and white space there. And then additionally, kind of vertical integration in the off benefit space, where you have things like Hims and Hers and Row and these companies that are provisioning care, diagnosing, prescribing, dispensing drugs, all in one shop. So tons of different models. I think all that have pros and cons and interesting things to vet out as adoption increases.
Okay, great point shared by you all. I'm excited because we already have our first question in the chat. It's from Jonathan, and he would like to ask his question live. So Jonathan, go ahead and unmute, please. And the floor is yours.
Sure. Hey, thanks everyone. So I had a question because I work at a biotech company and we work with neurologists, and some of our neurologists have spoken about the challenges of telehealth. I know we talk about some of the advantages in terms of being able to meet with patients in a safe manner, but some of the disadvantages include things like being able to assess particular details, especially if bandwidth is an issue. And I know you spoke about bandwidth earlier on. But things like eye movement, being able to assess and really zoom in on someone's eyes can be really difficult in a webcam type of setting, or things like practicality. So one neurologist pointed out that some of his patients, they're taking their Zoom calls like in their car in a parking lot. And if they're asked by the physician to walk around outside, they feel awkward, and it's hard to like point the camera at them when they walk around. So I'm just curious if any of our presenters have heard about technologies or anything of the like to help to address such challenges.
I have. I mean, but the challenges you're talking about, are some specific. So let me get a little bit. I have similarly worked with neurology-focused companies and some of the leading players out there who are trying to think about, one, especially in neurology, how the evolution of diagnostic techniques and endpoints are evolving as you think about functional cognitive tests, patient-reported outcomes, imaging, other biomarkers, and how they all connect together. So one of the things that's, let's say, take Alzheimer's as an example, right? I mean, imaging is one way to look at it. Then there are also cognitive and functional tests, but there are also clinician and patient-reported outcomes that can be done. But one of the things that people have thought about is, well, a component of the patient-reported outcomes questionnaire, for instance, could be done remotely or in advance, right? The imaging could be brought together, and some of the cognitive tests, for instance, could be done in a remote setting. When you start getting into observations by the clinician in a physical basis, or physical tests like a 6-minute walk test or other just functional mobility gait types of testing, those are still quite challenged. But having said that, there are technology companies that are trying to develop things where you can record, let's say, in your home in advance, a walking gait, and that's connected to something else like that, or even things where, video things which can tell if you fake swallow a pill or really swallow a pill and things like that, right? I mean, there are really interesting technologies out there, unproven yet, right? Still in development. And so when I think about telemedicine, it's rarely a situation, or remote medicine, it's rarely a situation where the idea is 100% of the function or the purpose of the meeting is distributed or remote, right? It's actually identifying which parts can be done remotely or asynchronously or through an electronic interface. But for those things that are in person, where there is no good substitute, those things are considered necessary, right? When people talk about sightless trials, like where you don't need a sight, well, nobody really wants to do a surgical trial without an operating room. At least I don't, right? So those types of things are. So it's a question of which function and what makes sense, and how do you use that as part of the system. There is no doubt that for many indications and many disease states, in person is going to be still a stalwart key part of assessment. But what if you could distribute some of it, and what efficiency could you gain there?
We have something that we call.
Would you say too, Ian? Go ahead, Ben.
I was going to say we have something that we call, when we work with providers on setting up telehealth, we call it webside manner, and it's how to look in the camera, how to position your EHR and the camera together, how to get comfortable on electronic health records. We did a test with a provider who'd been practicing for 20+ years, and I was the patient. I said, "Doc, my stomach hurts, the lights are really bright, I've got a headache," and he couldn't diagnose me, and all his colleagues in the room were going, "Migraine, migraine, migraine," and he couldn't do it. It took him a while to get into that mode of, this is a remote virtual visit. I need to ask different questions. I need to position myself. I need to communicate differently with that patient. It was really, really interesting. So we've kind of categorized it as website manner, and we work with the providers on that.
Thank you both.
Okay, we're going to go ahead and transition to Alexander Cheng. He has a question for the panel. Alexander, if you would like to unmute, please.
Okay, kind of building off the last question. Do you foresee perhaps like an over-reliance on telemedicine in the future that could potentially impact the systemic quality of service that physicians are able to provide in comparison to a face-to-face consultation?
I can jump in. I mean, can you hear me? Yeah. I don't foresee that. I think that it will kind of bear out over time. I mean, I think the outcomes have to be assessed of telehealth in comparison against in-person visits for all sorts of different use cases. And people, as healthcare becomes more consumer driven, are going to make the choice that's right for them based on their experience. And I think part of that too is patient satisfaction. I think consumer experience is going to become really important too. I feel like in COVID, there was this large scale adoption just because it was the only option. But as it matures, there's going to be a race to deliver good consumer experience. And I think that consumer experience in telehealth will compete with in-person, both kind of administratively and clinically. But I don't know if others have thoughts.
No, I agree. I think you're right with the consumer experience, but let's not also forget about the provider experience. They don't want to do telehealth. They want to see patients. They need to touch them. They need to see them. Some things can be done, post-visit follow-ups, we can do that virtually. I can do all my follow-up visits Friday afternoon and get it done with. But if you're an OB doctor, you need the patients to come in. So I think there's balancing that too.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think certainly in the transition period, right? When we figure out how do people adapt, both patients, providers, others to this new system, where do you go? I mean, I think in the long term, it'll be a net benefit for health, but we have to figure out which ones, what functions, and how to train people up on doing them. And I think I would make an argument though that I think it'll get better, but there's still going to be distortions and inefficiencies, right? It's just that the distortions are going to be different than the ones today. As an example, there are these minute clinics, or what people call urgent care clinics, right? Whether it's a minute clinic at a CVS or other things. And some people show up at those places with a heart attack because it says urgent care on them, right? And I mean, it's not most, and there are clear things that say, if you're having like a life-threatening emergency, go to the ER, call 911 or 911. You try to be clear, but people still show up. And if you're having a heart attack and you come in, and then we have to say, oh, well, we need to send you down the street. Heart attack, stroke, those types of things, minutes and seconds count. And there's a decline in outcome for that individual who thought they could go to an urgent care clinic there. When telemedicine becomes more prominent, you'll see other types of distortions that are there. And it's really up to the system to try to work through those and make sure people have a good understanding of sites of care, what's appropriate where, or whether to use telemedicine or not. I mean, one of the things that happened in COVID is that the number of deaths related to heart attack and stroke in hospitals and emergency rooms declined. Now, that's not because healthcare and people's cardiac health suddenly improved or their stress levels went down during COVID. It was because a bunch of people who had heart attack and stroke didn't go to the ER because they were afraid of COVID, and they died at their homes. Right, so that's a distortion, right? And you anytime you have a system like this, you have to work through that. So no doubt there's going to be things which have to be worked through, which will affect in the near term as we work through the quality of care. But overall, I mean, I think people are innovative. People want to think through. People want to improve care. So it's really working towards always making it better.
Great, thank you so much.
We're going to turn it over to Tiffany Cole. She has a question. Tiffany, if you could go ahead and unmute yourself, please.
Yeah, thanks for everyone who's been speaking. So historically, physicians have practiced in one geographical location, and over a series of years, they get to know the local disease burden, and that helps them make really educated diagnoses for their patients. But with telemedicine, we're kind of removing this geographical barrier, and like potentially losing a lot of this contextualized information of like local disease burden when we're potentially consulting over long distances. How do you feel people are kind of weighing these different factors, and how do we think health systems might kind of overcome this barrier of potentially losing that contextual information?
Yeah, I'll go quick here. There are a couple of things. So my doctor retired during COVID, and so I needed a new PCP. So I had a first consultation, and the first start off was actually information about my location and where I was, what it made sense, their care coverage. And so as part of it and as the packages, right, I mean, imagine, I actually believe that sometime in our lifetime, we're all going to be chipped like little pets with our healthcare information and GPS all attached and very big brothery, right? So, if those are actually integrated, then, you start being able to collect that information and potentially in a centralized way. And the other thing I would say is, I don't think, and I'd love to hear Ben and Oran's perspective on this, I don't think people would be making PCP decisions on like somebody who's located very far and remote. I personally, because I know that there are some things that are going to be needed in person, I still want a local PCP. I mean, my PCP now is a block from my home. It's terrific, right? So I'm hoping that most care systems and otherwise and providers still would encourage PCPs who are close by, who can do those in-person things when necessary, but then use telemedicine as needed for other things like a consult or follow-ups and things like that.
A couple thoughts of that. Yeah. One, I think you have a regulatory barrier there, and unless it's changed with COVID, you have, in order to see a patient, you have to be licensed in that state that they are actually in. So you have that barrier. Then you have the healthcare is local thing that you talked about as well. I think that plays a lot into it.
Yeah, I would just add on. I mean, I think the positive side is for communities that aren't well served in their local area. Telemedicine provides an opportunity that maybe wasn't there before, like specifically in the LGBT space. If you're in a rural area or you don't have doctors that kind of understand the primary concerns of LGBTQ plus folks, potentially telemedicine offers an opportunity to tap into other markets that previously weren't available and gets care that better fits you.
Okay, we're going to go ahead and switch gears. Orana, I know that you just touched on the point about LGBT care. So with that said, how has the shift to telemedicine affected the provision of care to the LGBT plus community?
Warren, Ben, happy to defer unless happy to start. I think there's a couple things. Look, first of all, LGBT care in a lot of cases is very similar to anybody else's care. The vast majority of our health problems are not necessarily specific to being LGBT necessarily, although obviously there are things that are very specific. Trans care is very specific to trans individuals, which is a little bit different. But most of my care, I mean, these days people are like, what's my blood pressure? And oh my gosh, now I need bifocals, right? This is not an LGBT issue per se. But having said that, there are specific areas that we think about, right? As we think about underserved populations or access or specific questions, right? The questions around, PrEP, HIV care, frankly, elder-specific care related to LGBTQ issues, frankly, family care related to families that have to do with fertility or surrogacy, which, I mean, if you look at the IVF market, most of the growth is coming from the LGBTQ community, not from straight couples, as an example. So you have that over-index. But I will say this. One, access to care and the ability to talk to folks, especially who don't have access to care. A trans individual, in a remote, or gay or lesbian individual in a remote place who needs to talk to somebody. And there are huge issues with people having conversations about PrEP, even today, from people who are either willfully ignorant or just uneducated on the issue. That creates an opportunity for people to connect in those types of situations. Very similarly, as you think about psychiatric care that are related to the issues that LGBTQ individuals face, finding folks who are actually specialized or finding communities of people that you can talk to, also a benefit in telemedicine. As you think about recovery groups with respect to addiction, these are also areas where, very interestingly, prior to COVID, right, and blank anonymous meeting was like almost universally recommended to be in person, and that still defaults that if you can do it. But because of necessity, people created new formats that still work for things like AA or NA, where people have a chance to actually get together and do it remotely with actually people that they feel more connected to. People who have common backgrounds or interests or demographics. And those are all really great benefits for how telemedicine can transform things. Now, having said that, there's also a benefit of medicine in those places that have concentration of care. Key West and Provincetown, which, acted as, for lack of a better word, colonies for HIV patients who fled sort of mainstream healthcare in the 70s, 80s, and 90s to those places. And how do you do that? Or frankly, Fenway in Boston as a concentration of care and services that are not just a holistic set of services. So I do think you need to balance those. It's very, very critical to access people who have the expertise or common story of you, but it's also important for people to access that local healthcare.
Yeah, I agree. Access is the key there.
Yeah, just to add on, I mean, I completely agree, and with the idea certainly that COVID exacerbated existing conditions and disparities. I guess one thing I just add to, I feel like the overall acceleration of telehealth and telemedicine created opportunity for LGBT-specific startups, kind of in that vertically integrated model that I mentioned earlier, and I was sharing with the panel when we were prepping. I've seen a bunch of ads come through for a transgender telehealth company called Plume. Others, Queer Doc, Folks Health has recently raised some funds from venture capital. So there's opportunity as telehealth gains more widespread adoption for kind of really specific targeted companies towards the LGBTQ+ community.
Okay, I'm going to turn it over now to Shankar. He has a question for the panel. Shankar?
Yeah. No, yeah, thanks. I mean, I think you guys addressed this a little bit, but just to give a little bit background about me, I'm an internal medicine doctor. So prior to my MBA, I worked in that area. So what I noticed a lot, at least prior to COVID, is that I worked at a healthcare system where over a quarter of our visits on the outpatient side were actually telehealth. And we tried to sort of like raise it higher than that. But I noticed a lot of patients like didn't want to make it telehealth for a lot of issues that they could be seen like either over the phone or over video or so. So like, do you think like there's an education barrier, I guess I know we still don't know as providers, like what we can do like virtually or not. But maybe COVID sort of solved that problem, that maybe a lot of the patients sort of understood that. And then another question is, I've also noticed like during the pandemic that with telehealth, so I feel like the doctor's a little bit even more overwhelmed because instead of fitting one patient in 10 minutes, the schedulers like fit like two patients in like 10 minutes or so. And they sort of like, how do you sort of like manage that perception that like we can see double the amount of patients just because it's virtual, because that's not true.
Yeah. Totally, I can start on this one. I mean, I feel like, I think there's a lot of consumer preferences, whether it's the person receiving care or the person delivering care. And I mean, this is just me talking, but I mean, I feel like people are weird and have different comfort levels with different things. And I mean, I can speak personally. like I did some telehealth dermatology appointments during COVID, and I much preferred that to going in person. I felt like when I first, apologies to any dermatologists like in the group, I hate the dermatologist, but I hate going in person to the dermatologist. And I felt that the telehealth visit with the dermatologist was like way better. I wasn't waiting. Like the setup was really great from the clinic. I felt like my individual dermatologist actually was better from a bedside manner perspective online versus in person. I think she's like super awkward in the office, and that was different online. And it was quick, and it was one of these things where I kind of routine, and I kind of knew what I needed. So I didn't need a very elaborate consultation. And so that felt really good, and something that I would continue as a consumer using as telehealth. And I think there are probably any number of permutations of that based on the person receiving care and the provider. And just to touch on, I think the timing thing is kind of interesting. I feel like the dermatologist, again, is a good example, because I feel like they're a specialty that like kind of pumps people, out. This particular visit that I had was like 10 minutes, and I did have a sense a little bit that I was even being rushed. And I'm like, come on, like we have just a handful of minutes here. Like you can take 10 minutes with me. But I think it gets back to reimbursement. I think that is certainly going to be a big driver, I think, in terms of how these providers are paid for the service, and if it's at parity with the in-office. So if like, is it an equal change basically to shift some or all of their schedule from in-person to virtual? What does that affect on their reimbursement and how they get paid? And then also from the payer perspective, certainly at United Healthcare, and I think at other payers, at least this year in response to COVID, there was really an expansion of benefits. So again, using the same dermatology visit, I was able to have that visit at no charge. I think once the patient's pocketbook is a part of the mix as well, I think that'll be a factor too.
You've asked it's got a big answer to the question. I think you have technology differences, not having smartphones, not having good access to internet, that can cause issues. You have, dermatology is a good example. We see really high utilization in dermatology. We see high utilization in behavioral health as well, which we really haven't talked much about. Removing the stigma, having to go to an office, being able to talk to somebody in the comfort of your own home. We see, huge benefits in that. I think it's all kind of thrown up in the air, and we're trying to figure out what works really well. What are providers comfortable with? What are patients comfortable with? How's that provider going to get paid, like you said, Oren? It's a huge thing. Hopefully we'll get there and figure it all out.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I also, the other thing, and to that point, is I would say it's not one directional, right, in terms of people are less comfortable through telemedicine versus others. I bet there are some people on this Zoom call right now who, if somebody calls them on their phone, are sort of like, why didn't they text first, right? And let's be honest, some people are more comfortable with virtual interaction than otherwise. And I have to be honest, if I have a busy day, I prefer and I don't have to have an in-person visit, I prefer that. And under COVID, at least, especially in the beginning of COVID, I didn't want to go outside because there are some idiots around there, with their masks off and getting into my face. And so, I think it's going to depend by person, but it is a retraining for all society. Like we're all going through this together.
We're going to continue with the questions. I'm going to turn now to Heather Martin. She has a question for the panel. Are you there? She might have stepped away. All right, we'll turn it over to Carlos.
Yeah.
Carlos also has a question.
Hi, so thank you can you hear me well?
Mm-hmm.
All right, thank you so much for being here. So Yeah, similar to Shankar, I'm also a provider and a PCP, so I've tried to kind of like adapt myself right into this whole thing. But something that I am very kind of like concerned about is maybe kind of like the interoperability frameworks among these things. Because so when we were in March, right, like the first telemedicine initiatives like were starting kind of like to sink in, etc. But all of a sudden I end up like with 10 different apps in my phone. They all vibrate at the same time for different reasons at different times. So it's kind of like, I am very curious to hearing your opinions about like, how do we try to integrate those systems into something that works for different things? Because like, of course, when you're in a dermatology practice or a psychiatric practice, like you have, right, a certain types of patients that respond like due to the nature of their experiences and their issues. But in my case, I see everyone. And in turn, when you see everyone, you really try kind of like the one thing that tries to integrate all. And I don't see that happening, or I don't know if kind of like if what would be your opinion looking forward towards that? Because I think that will definitely improve at least the provider experience for many of us.
Yeah, I mean, to start, number one, because we're in the innovation stage, that's what happens. Proliferation of apps, programs, everything else that's there. And you'd be amazed at how much money tech companies make who do nothing but do what's called single sign-on. Okay, so this idea of single sign-on for whatever apps you need to do. I mean, even those companies that aggregate your financial information, which are super creepy, by the way, but those who aggregate your financial information in one place so you can look at it, is sort of a single sign-on concept. So I do think over time, certain platforms will come to lead. And the interoperability will increase, and sort of the interfaces will be, and some of it will be single sign-on or more standardized, or through standardized platform. I mean, whether physicians like it or hate it, right? I mean, Epic is ubiquitous for a lot of folks that are out there, and more things are being integrated into Epic, as clunky as it may be, right? And so I think you're going to see that. But I'll be honest, in this innovation period, I think you're going to see more proliferation first, rather than integration, but then eventually get into integration.
Interoperability is a huge issue within healthcare. If you go to two different hospitals, you're two different patients. But you're one person, right? So it's a huge issue we've tackled forever. I would see EHRs at some point making sure that telehealth is a part of their EHR, especially now that there's reimbursement for it. One of the things with our design philosophy at Alteus when we're creating the virtual health products is really, how do I integrate this into a provider's workflow as easily as possible, where a telehealth visit is just like a well child visit. I want it simple for the provider to access. I don't want them signing on to something else. I don't want another chart for them to fill out. I don't want another calendar. How can I make this as easy as possible?
Okay, we have a question from Robert Nance. He says he works in the medical education and he has physicians resistant to telemedicine due to being able, due to being able to give the students a good experience. Are there ways to give the students a good experience using telemedicine?
Yes.
Go ahead, Oren.
No. Go ahead. I'm just, I can't help but be positive and hope for it. You go first, Ian.
Rather, it's a great point. I actually work with a number of med ed companies as well, thinking about this dynamic. And so one, I do think that I see physician resistance, but I also see certain segments of physicians saying, yes, this is what I want, right? In terms of more med ed, or frankly, even beyond med ed, even collaboration tools that are both synchronous and asynchronous, glorified versions of Slack or Microsoft Teams or whatnot that people are thinking about in order to do these things. But I think, even if you take a look at Zoom and Microsoft Teams and the innovation that they have done during COVID, right? Or even, we're using Pathable here in terms of remote Rhomba. I assure you, I have to be honest, I prefer to be with all of you in person right now. Like Rambo is way more fun in my mind in that environment. I get to see people, you get to really meet people. You know, this is working for what we can do fairly well. And you know, this is an engaged conversation with a lot of you. So I will say that as we learn better, and this is from a media perspective and consumption perspective, how do people pay attention online versus otherwise? How do you engage them? How do you think about asynchronous communication, right? These ideas of how often do you have to have new content on a website or on a platform for people to engage? Those types of things are getting more sophisticated. And as we learn the pedagogical method electronically, I think that will improve. Also, I think, you know, for lack of a better thing, there is a generational component to this, right? You know, physicians, while there are some 80-year-old physicians who are everything, you know, social media constantly and are on Facebook all the time, generationally, right? Like it is more and more accepted to use Slack and other things like that as a primary medium for younger physicians. And so I do think it'll change, but I think part of it is also us getting better at figuring out how people like to interact in an electronic way.
Yeah, totally. And I think just to add, I mean, to the extent that telemedicine and delivering care electronically becomes table stakes on the front end in the education process, you know, students have to embrace it if they want to be prepared for, you know, a future of care delivery that is delivered at least in part virtually.
The other thing I'd add is, you know, being a part of a product management team, I really would enjoy working really closely with clinicians to see what their experiences are and to help them get better at that, to build technology, to make a telemedicine visit more comfortable. So I think more of that, more clinical input is going to help.
Thank you. So just a quick note, we were planning on doing breakout rooms. However, I think we have a good conversation going on right now. So we'll continue with what we're doing, and I'll turn it over to Jeffrey Vu, who has a question.
Hey, how's it going? My name is Jeff. I'm a nurse practitioner working in primary care and also in telehealth. We have a telehealth offering where we do cash-based services. But because prior to COVID, we weren't doing telehealth was not reimbursable by insurance, right? And this has been a long ongoing conversation for in general. So I guess the question is to the panelists and the organizations that you guys represent, you know, what do we think is going to be happening in a post-COVID world if we ever get to a post-COVID world? And how are we advocating for telehealth to be kind of part of care delivery in general?
Well, the rest of the world may get to a post-COVID world, maybe not the US, but joking aside, I think, I don't know. I mean, Ben and Oren are going to have a future view. My view in most things in healthcare is if it is necessary, we work out a way, right? It may be painful, it may take some time, but we work out a way. I mean, even if you think about reimbursement for gene therapies and curative therapies, like how do you figure that out? How do you appropriately discount or do it in annuity or other things, right? We're figuring out a way. And I don't know what the answer is, but Ben and Oren, I suspect, have more insight.
Yeah, I think that we're definitely preparing for telehealth to be here to stay on a number of fronts. I mean, I feel like from a consumer centricity perspective, we're thinking of solutions with consumers' kind of modes of interaction and how they want to engage with us front and center, and that's becoming digital on a number of fronts. I think too, just the business imperative around, I mean, I work in the Optin Rx space, so pharmacy, and some of these models that I've talked about, the vertically integrated pharmacy and care delivery, competitive pressures from folks like GoodRx that are pushing much more into telehealth beyond just you know, cash discount coupons for generics. There's a ton of action in the pharmacy space around telehealth, virtual delivery of care, new ways to dispense, and so forth. And so we're definitely keyed in on that and creating strategies to capitalize to the extent possible and serve our consumers the best we can.
Yeah, I think it will continue to see reimbursement in telehealth. You know, I work for payer basically, and we're paying for telehealth visits to providers. Also, going back to the question of medical organizations that carry risk on the patients are going to be using telehealth because it's cheaper. The value prop is it's more inexpensive to see patients with chronic conditions to do check-ins using telehealth than it is having them drive all the way over, you know, to see the doctor. Frees up front desk resources to do other things. There's a big cost savings there. So I do expect it to continue.
Hey, one thing I was just going to add too, we have a venture capital fund at Optum called Optin Ventures that has a number of cool startups that we're investing in. And I've been talking with them quite a bit actually in ways to partner. So thinking about things like that, new opportunities. So one example I'll give, there's this company called Mindstrong there that is for folks with severe mental illness. And it basically works off like what they call biomarkers, and just your phone behavior touches things that are going on with how you're acting on your phone, and it informs how and if a clinical intervention might be necessary. And they have a clinical team that reaches out, and there's a whole engagement model and so on and so forth. So kind of a cool new, like kind of cutting edge thing in the behavioral health space and AI, digital, et cetera. And then from within kind of our core business, like where I sit, I'm thinking about that saying, you know, could engagement with an app and an experience like Mindstrong create better adherence outcomes for folks who are on behavioral health meds? And so can I, you know, through our existing adherence program, identify people who, you know, might be at risk to not fill their drug or not go for a first fill in the first place, and direct them somehow to Mindstrong, create an experience there, and see if that has, you know, good member engagement, creates good outcomes, et cetera, et cetera. So just one example about how we were getting creative, I think, and trying to leverage assets across our enterprise from mature businesses within Optum and UHG and startups as well.
That's a great point, and that actually ties into my next question that I would like for the rest of the panel, if they could comment on that, as to how technology in the healthcare industry in terms of AI, VI, augmented reality as well, is changing how we know healthcare today.
So I can start. So AI is getting better, right? From a legal perspective, AI can only be a suggester, not a diagnoser, right? So we have to get past that. So we're starting to see AI in websites. I think we're going to see it. We're going to see it more often. VR and AR, I see VR as a form of training exercise, maybe as a form of therapy, recovery from treatment. AR, maybe perhaps helping people with empathy, more training issues. So it's here, but I think right now it's just a suggestion. If we can do data analytics and give providers and use AI to give providers suggestions, or even a patient through an app saying, hey, you might have this is the direction you should go. I think that's where we're at, but it's gonna stay there until we've got some legal changes.
Okay, with that said, if everyone who's here today, for the attendees, if in the chat they could just type in if they are a pre-MBA student, currently in their MBA program or if they're actually a postgraduate professional. Just want to gauge and see what the audience is that we have here today. If you could all put that in the chat, thank you. So current MBA. We have one postgraduate. So while you all type that in, we are almost out of time with about 2 minutes left. We could go past the hour at 4. Are there any other questions from the audience that you would like to ask the panel before we go? Okay, with that said, I'm going to turn it back to the panel to see if there's any closing statement or closing remark that they want to say before we go.
Oran and Ben, why don't you guys start?
Thanks
sure,
for your interest.
Go.
Oh, go. I just, thanks for the interest in this panel. This has been an industry and segment that's been, had a lot of interest in. And I'm often surprised about how many people go, I can see a doctor online pre-COVID. I'm surprised at people, oh, I can do that online. So it's really cool to see the interest, and it gives me hope in the general direction of where we can go with telehealth.
Yeah, agreed. Just thanks to Ben and Ian and George, for the panel and this discussion. It's great. Thanks to you all for joining and for embracing the content of Ramba. It's great to see so many folks, jumping in and enjoying and embracing this different format and finding a way to make it work. From a professional perspective, I always love and kind of miss the after the panel business card swap and things like that. But happy to connect offline with folks. You can find me on LinkedIn, and happy to be a resource as I can and to answer other questions about Optum and United should you have them.
Thank you. And just to close out, I mean, look, LEK loves Ramba. We love this stuff. And Joe and I, sort of as partners in our healthcare practice, we live and breathe the stuff and the topics that we're talking about, working with great innovative companies that are doing it. I'm sure Optum and Alteris also always looking for good, interesting talent for these types of things who are really interested in this. And so I would say all of us are very interested. We're the consulting firm, and you've got some payer provider folks as well. So I think we can cover a lot of the bases. So if you have interest, you want to do those things, please reach out to any of us. We're very much interested at any of the levels you're talking about. We have pre-MBAs, MBAs, we have postgrads, we have physicians, we have FPNs and otherwise, FNPs out there, not FPNs out there. So lots of you are professionals, biotech folks. We welcome them all. So please do join us. Thank you for your time, and it's a real pleasure talking to you all today.
Okay, with that said, I want to say thank you to the panel as well for being here today to share your perspective. Thank you to my co-host who's been there in the background taking care of all the technical parts of this call. And of course, thank you to the audience for tuning in and for being really engagement with the question. Please enjoy the rest of the Ramba 2020 conference and have a great day.